Welcome to Consider It Life. Last time we did part 1 of a reaction video to Zen Buddhism. So this time we'll just do part 2, and then we'll wrap up with a little bit of philosophy.
Oh, yeah. You gotta stop doing acid and listening to Alan Watts, bro. Okay, I know this is confusing, but I just want to point out that this really isn't that far out there as an idea, because like plenty of modern philosophers and neuroscientists hold views similar to that of Buddhism's. For example, David Hume, famous Scottish philosopher, describes the self as a bundle of experiences, with no fundamental you that exists independently from the bundle.
Okay, this is interesting. I'll let him get into the quote here, but yeah, Hume is a famous Scottish philosopher. He's also a famous skeptic, and because one of the principles that he denies is a principle of causality. Right? He says there's thing A and there's thing B, and we see we see this constant conjunction of events. Thing A happens, and then event A happens, and then event B happens. But again, if you go back to the Philosophy 101, I talked about the 10 Aristotelian categories and the agent-patient relationship. And there I gave the example of a person walking along a beach, right? When their foot steps into the sand and they leave a footprint, the foot is the agent, and the sand is what's called a patient, right? The agent is the cause, and the patient is the effect. But in Aquinas's view, these are not two events. These are not the event of the foot stepping down and then the sand receiving the foot. It's both are happening simultaneously. It's simultaneous causality. So because David Hume breaks these things up into cause and effect that are two events rather than one, once he breaks them into two events, he can't see any rational justification for putting them back together. So he becomes skeptical about causality itself, or that we could have any sort of philosophical justification for causality. Well, the truth is, you took a single event, the agent-patient relationship, and then you broke it into two, and then you couldn't figure out how to put it back together. So you became skeptical. So it's interesting that these guys are going down this path of Humean skepticism.
Instead of there being one thing that is the self, there's rather a bunch of interconnected things interacting together, which creates the illusion of there being a singular I. And there is no thing that is.
And actually, bundle theory is still accepted among contemporary philosophers, as they look at not just humans, but as they look at concrete particulars. There's some stripe of analytic contemporary philosophers who accept a bundle theory that what a thing is just a collection of its properties.
Separate from the bundle to perceive it. But I'm not doing his position any justice. I'd recommend reading some of what he wrote. I can't summarize everything he said just in one video, you know? And you might also hear people say things like, you don't exist, or there is no you. And that might sound like something you'd hear from your friend who does a little too much acid, but the idea isn't that there literally is no you, or that reality is just a dream or anything like that. It's more like there is no unified, persisting you, even if it feels like there is. Other contemporary philosophers like Thomas Metzinger have views that are also pretty similar to this, and he describes the self as a physical process of the brain instead of a thing or an innermost core. He goes as far as to say that selves don't exist at all, and no one has ever had a self. And I'll be honest, I don't fully understand this position. It's based on research regarding illusions of phantom limbs and a bunch of other shit, but I guess it would be fair to say, well, hold on, a process is also a thing, and like, so what if the self isn't some essence or fundamental core, and instead it's a process? What real difference does it make?
And I guess he mentioned neuroscience earlier. I guess if Metzinger is a neuroscientist, this is the downside to having a fully naturalistic worldview. The body reduces to the brain reduces to the neural maps in it. And then what happens is this, things like a persisting self vanishes because you can't ground it in a purely physical way. Now, you either bite the bullet and say, well, then there is no persistent self, or you say, well, then maybe there's an immaterial aspect of the self that naturalism just either ignores or can't account for.
And that's pretty much where I'm at with this topic. It seems like people are just debating semantics when it comes to what exactly the self is. But, there's...
It's not semantics. It's concepts. They're not just debating words. Those words carry concepts about the self. Now, again, when it comes to the self, the mind, consciousness, awareness, it's harder to pin these terms down. But it's not just a debate over terms. It's a debate over ideas.
Probably something I'm missing. But the reason why understanding the concept of the self or not self is important has to do with how they thought about attachment. So Buddha taught that clinging or attachment is what causes suffering. To cling means to hold on to something with the misunderstanding that that thing is permanent. Just as clinging to a sensation of happiness can lead to disappointment when the feeling inevitably goes away, same goes for the sense of being a self that we experience. And the sense of being a unified self is simply another thing we become attached to.
Now, again, the problem here is that these are some really good points. So you're taking something that is very practical, that things like happiness or some happy moment, they're impermanent, which is why we can't make the pursuit of happiness or the feeling of happiness the be all end all of our existence, because like we said in the video, I think on being your true self, you can't just maximize pleasure all the time. You can't just pursue happiness all the time. Sometimes there's self-sacrifice involved. Sometimes there's pain involved, right? So this isn't wrong. Nothing is permanent, but there is there's a flow of time. And as temporal beings, we have to be aware of that. I mean, the psalmist says, let us number our days that we may gain a heart of wisdom, right? Because our life is finite. Things are finite. Things are impermanent. But that doesn't draw us all the way down to nothing is permanent or there is no persistent self. That's just too far.
This is because nothing is permanent. No thought, no sensation, no experience is permanent. Everything is in a constant state of change. Everything comes and goes. And it is when we trick ourselves into believing that we can hold on to something forever, we create the conditions for suffering. And just to clarify, when Buddhists say suffering, they don't just mean like extreme physical pain. It means something more along the lines of dissatisfaction or disappointment.
Yeah, in some of the reading that I did leading up to this video, one of the things that one of the comparative religion scholars said that we have to understand in the West is that this idea of the transmigration of souls or reincarnation, he says, it's not even debated in the East. It's just accepted as a basic axiom, right? That there is such a thing as reincarnation, that people, and so his point was that the suffering that Buddha was trying to overcome was the suffering of this perpetual state of reincarnation, that no matter how much pleasure you have in this life, that is impermanent. Not just the sensation that fades the next day or the next week or whatever, but even a lifetime filled with pleasure is impermanent, because then you die and then you start over again in some other form, or, and so the suffering and attachment is very much in the context of this Eastern context of reincarnation, and so and this millions of lifetimes of reincarnation that causes this existential crisis that Buddhism is trying to extricate us from.
Something I haven't mentioned yet is that there's a certain element of humor in Zen. A lot of stories used to aid teaching students are set up almost like jokes, and humor is kind of like a form of Zen, because if something is funny, you laugh spontaneously. It's involuntary, which is similar to how they think of enlightenment. A lot of Zen stories involve some mundane interaction between student and teacher, and the story will end with the student suddenly becoming enlightened. My favorite one goes like this. A monk says to his teacher, "I've been at this monastery for quite some time, and I've yet to receive any instruction from you on how to attain Buddhahood. Well, have you had your breakfast yet? The teacher responds, yes, says the monk. Well, then go and wash your bowl. At that moment, the monk was enlightened. And you see this a lot in Zen stories, where partaking in usual, boring, everyday life activities can lead to some sudden insight, which is...
Well, I think my takeaway from the wash your bowl thing is people talk about mindfulness or things like that. I'm not exactly sure what all that term entails, but there is a presentness here, that focusing on the present, being where you are, as it were, that I think is extremely helpful. Jesus in Matthew 6 says, each day has enough trouble of its own. You don't worry about the past and you don't worry about the future. Each day has enough trouble of its own, right? So, which I think is sound advice.
Which is where the idea of direct transmission comes in. It's as if the teacher is somehow able to evoke some sudden insight within the student that goes beyond the normal, logical way of understanding things. And there are stories of Zen masters farting out loud at inappropriate moments, which somehow results in the sudden awakening of students. There are stories of Zen masters literally chopping cats in half just to make a point. And there's also lots of confusing, paradox.
Okay, I have 2 cats. I love cats. If killing a cat leads me to enlightenment, I'm just not going to be enlightened.
Statements. Zen masters are kind of like pranksters who don't really take themselves too seriously, but I think there is a point to all the weird stuff they do and say. Another thing that is used often in some schools of Zen is koans. Koans are kind of like riddles used to aid in meditation. The most famous one is probably, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Now, there's a lot of debate over what this means and what the answer is. Some say the answer is nothing, because there is no sound. You can't clap with one hand.
Now, this brings up something that I read in one of my comparative religion books, and that is that these koans are meant to release you from this rational mode of thinking. And my response to that is that, well, as an Aristotelian, if humans are rational animals, I want a mode of being that enables me to be everything that I am. I think we should be rational. Sorry, that's an equivocation. We are rational animals in that we are created with the power of reason that animals don't have, but also rationality in terms of using logic as a tool by means of which to analyze thoughts and ideas. Right? I don't want to practice that divorces that from me. Now, it has its place. When my wife asks me if I'm hungry for dinner, I don't answer her in a syllogism. But yeah, I really don't. I don't want to embrace a way of life that tells me that happiness entails ignoring logic or rationality.
But others say the point is that they are impossible to answer, and that this conflict can evoke the sudden insight that they're seeking. And that's partly why I like Zen Buddhism. A lot of the teachers don't take themselves too seriously. And it honestly kind of seems like a lot of them are just bored and trolling people who are taking the enlightenment stuff a little too seriously. Yeah, I still don't really get it, bro. Well, there isn't anything to be gotten. Bruh, you know that doesn't make sense. But there's no sense to be made in the first place. What the hell? You can levitate? Yeah, dude. I'm a level 99 Zen.
Okay, I think stuff's starting to get a little weird. I think that's enough for our purposes. Now, there's one of the things that sparked my interest in looking at Zen Buddhism was I have this book by Jacques Maritain on natural law, where he talks about connaturality and things like that. Okay, Maritain says this, but before I look at that, there's something called the theoretical virtues, not the theological virtues, which are faith, hope, and love. But theoretical virtues are virtues that theories have that make, say, theory A better than theory B. This is typically talked about in the context of the philosophy of science. But so simplicity, explanatory power, explanatory scope, fecundity, that is fruitfulness. How much does one idea bear fruit in other areas? Things like that. So one of the reasons I like Aristotelian Thomism as a system is because of its explanatory scope. So when we're met with something like a Zen Buddhism, you go, something's going on there that is satisfying. The meditative aspect, the detachment from physical objects. Now, I think these things can be had without the Eastern backdrop. Like, we talked about Stoicism. Stoicism very much has an aspect of being detached from material things or something like that. But the meditative aspect of Buddhism is something that people find very attractive. And in terms of explanatory scope, Maritain says this, and I think this really does get at what's going on for the Zen meditation stuff. He says this. There is, I think, another kind of mystical experience, which, in contradistinction to the one I just mentioned, he's talking about the experience of sort of a mystical union with God. And we talked about that in our video on Christian mysticism. Another kind of mystical experience, which, in contradistinction to the one I just mentioned, may be called natural mystical experience. An example of which we can find in Plotinus and in the schools of Indian contemplation. There he goes. That's a sort of a reference to Hinduism, Buddhism. I can only state in a few words the conclusions here of a certain amount of research I did on the matter. Here again, to my mind, we have to do with a particular type of knowledge, both supraconceptual and through connaturality. But the connaturality in question here is merely intellectual, and the essential part played by the will consists in forcing the intellect inwards, against the grain of nature, and in obliging it to empty itself of any particular representation. The reality to be experienced is the very existence, the very esse of the self in its pure metaphysical actuality. And it is by means of a supreme effort of intellectual and voluntary concentration, sweeping away any possible image, recollection, or idea, any passing phenomenon, and any distinct consciousness. In other words, it is through the void that the intellect is co-natured to the unconceptualizable spiritual reality of the thing known. So what Maritain is saying is this. He's basically describing the process that we just met in the Zen Buddhism video. But what he's saying is that this is what he calls a natural mystical experience, because there is a sense of existence or being part of a unified reality. And if we can empty ourselves of any particular thoughts or ideas or phenomena, we can focus on our, not our distinctness from the overall unified being, but our union with it. And this is what he calls a superconceptual, natural mystical experience of being co-natured with just a sort of a generic spiritual reality. And again, I think that is a perfect explanation for what is going on in the meditative aspect of Zen Buddhism. There may be a criticism that the video itself was overly simplistic, but I think it strikes at the right level of where people are going to enter into an attraction to Buddhism. Of all the things that I've read, it basically gets the gist correct. It actually explores some tethers from elements of Buddhism to Western philosophy, for example, in David Hume. And so, is it the most scholarly approach to Buddhism? No, because Buddhism is a very complex system. Like we said, there's Theravada and Mahayana Buddhism, but Zen Buddhism, this stripped down version of Buddhism, I think it pretty much gets it right. So on that hand, I think we did a fair job of reacting to what Buddhism actually holds to, at least Zen Buddhism.